Ah, look who's still standing. Hello to the one they tried to erase with numbers. Hello to the name that kept showing up in rooms where it was no longer invited. Hello to the presence that didn't disappear, no matter how loud the noise got. Yes, they thought it would work this time. They really did. They believed that if enough voices spoke at once, your own would get lost. That if enough people agreed on a version of you, you would eventually accept it. That if pressure came from all sides, you'd finally bend, finally explain yourself, finally crack. But you didn't, and that's what unsettles them most. You didn't match their expectations of collapse. You didn't perform the breakdown they rehearsed in their heads. You didn't give them the satisfaction of panic, or the relief of watching you scramble to defend yourself. You stayed calm while they escalated. You stayed quiet while they grew louder. You stayed grounded while they gathered momentum. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, something shifted. At first, they didn't notice it. They were too busy talking to each other, too busy comparing notes, trading impressions, reinforcing the story they wanted to believe. They spoke about you, not to you, analyzed you without asking, decided things on your behalf. They thought isolation would weaken you. They thought silence meant submission. They mistook your restraint for confusion. But your silence wasn't confusion. It was calculation. Not the cold kind, not the manipulative kind, the grounded kind. The kind that comes from realizing you don't owe everyone access to your inner world. You watched them align. You felt the shift when casual opinions hardened into shared conclusions. You noticed when individual discomfort turned into collective judgment. And you did something they didn't expect. You didn't rush in to correct them. You didn't gather allies of your own. You didn't try to outnumber them back. You didn't argue your humanity into rooms that had already decided not to hear it. You stepped back, not in defeat. In clarity, that's the part they still don't understand. They think strength looks like confrontation. They think survival requires noise. They think being right means being seen, agreeing with. They never learned what happens when someone removes themselves emotionally without leaving physically. You were still there, still present, still breathing the same air, but they no longer had access to you. No reactions to provoke, no explanations to dissect, no emotional threads to pull. And that made them uneasy. Because when numbers fail to produce control, people start questioning the numbers. They started watching you more closely after that. Not openly, quietly. The pauses before you spoke. The way you listened without leaning forward. The way your expression didn't change when theirs did. You didn't flinch when opinions hardened. You didn't soften when pressure increased. You didn't, and that lack of performance disrupted the rhythm they were used to. Most people, when surrounded by judgment, start negotiating. They explain more. They apologize for things they didn't do. They shrink, hoping smaller will mean safer. You didn't shrink. You got still. And stillness, when it's intentional, is unsettling. They tried reading into it. Cold, they thought. Arrogant, they whispered. Disconnected, they concluded. But none of those labels fit, and they felt it. Because coldness reacts, arrogance defends, disconnection avoids. You did none of that. You stayed, not to fight, not to prove, just to exist as you were, and that forced them to sit with themselves. They didn't like that part. Because when you stop reacting, the spotlight moves. When you stop participating, the dynamic changes. When you stop validating assumptions with emotional energy, people are left holding their own projections. They expected you to push back. You didn't. They expected you to collapse inward. You didn't. They expected you to explain who you were. You didn't, and slowly, something began to crack in the collective certainty they had built. Questions crept in. Why aren't they responding? Why don't they seem affected? Why aren't they trying to fix this? They mistook your peace for indifference, your boundaries for arrogance, your quiet for strategy. But the truth was simpler. You had already moved on internally, not away from the space, not away from the people, away from the need to be understood by those committed to misunderstanding you. That's a hard thing to accept for people who rely on consensus to feel right. Because if you're not fighting their version of you, then maybe their version doesn't matter. And that idea scares people who built unity around judgment. They needed you to react. They needed you to care loudly. They needed you to validate the pressure by acknowledging it. Your calm robbed them of that. You became stronger through silence, not confrontation. Wider through restraint, not expansion. Clearer through distance, not explanation. They called it withdrawal. It wasn't. It was selection. You stopped offering energy where it was being consumed instead of respected. You stopped feeding conversations that required you to be smaller to be accepted. You stopped negotiating your reality with people who had already chosen a narrative, and that's when the balance shifted. Because numbers only work when the individual believes they're alone. You didn't believe that. Not because you had support, not because you had backup, but because you had yourself. A regulated nervous system, a grounded sense of worth, an internal authority that didn't depend on being liked. They couldn't reach that, so they escalated. More opinions, more whispers, more urgency. But urgency doesn't move someone who's already decided where they stand. You watched it all without absorbing it. You let their words pass through you instead of into you. You heard the noise without translating it into meaning. You stayed present without being entangled. And in doing so, you did something quietly radical. You refused to collapse into the role they assigned you. That's when they realized something had gone wrong. Not with you, with the plan. Because the plan depended on you needing their approval. The plan depended on you defending your place. The plan depended on you fearing exclusion. You didn't. You accepted the separation without drama. You allowed the distance without resentment. You carried yourself as if your value was already settled, and that unsettled them deeply. Because when someone survives collective pressure without hardening, without lashing out, without retreating into bitterness, it forces a reckoning. Not yours, theirs. They started feeling it in the quiet moments, in the gaps between conversations, in the way your name landed differently now, not powerful, unresolved. You became the unanswered question, the presence they couldn't categorize, the one they couldn't break, couldn't recruit, couldn't define. You weren't fighting their system. You were no longer, and that's what made all the difference. They thought you were still playing, still measuring yourself by the same rules, still waiting for the same signals. You weren't. You had already stepped beyond the framework where numbers decide truth, beyond the space where volume equals authority, beyond the environment that mistook emotional escalation for strength. You won by not needing to. And now, even as you stand there quietly, even as you move through your days without announcement, something is undeniably different. They feel it. They don't know what to call it yet. They don't know what it means. They just know the dynamic has changed, and it isn't going back, not because you're holding a grudge, not because you're seeking distance, but because once you survive being overwhelmed without losing yourself, there's no returning to who you were before. This isn't the end. It's the moment before everything becomes irreversible. And here's the part they never prepared for: the aftermath. Because pressure is loud, but aftermath is quiet. And quiet is where truth settles. They expected bitterness you'd wear. They expected some visible mark of damage they could point to and say, "See, that's what happens." But when the noise died down, when the conversation slowed, when the alignment they built started to loosen, they looked again, and you were still standing. Not rigid, not defensive, not hardened into something sharp and brittle, just solid. That's when confusion replaced confidence. Because collective pressure is supposed to leave residue. It's supposed to change the way someone moves, the way they speak, the way they trust. And yes, it changed you. Just not in the way they needed it to. You didn't become guarded. You became precise. You didn't become distant. You became selective. You didn't become cold. You became clear. And clarity is dangerous to people who rely on ambiguity to maintain control. They started noticing the small things first, how you no longer lingered in conversations that drained you, how you didn't explain your choices, how you didn't rush to smooth over discomfort that wasn't yours to carry. You weren't rude about it. You weren't dramatic. You were simply done performing, and that terrified them more than any reaction ever could. Because reactions keep dynamics alive. Silence ends them, not the silent treatment, not avoidance, the kind of silence that comes from resolution, the kind that says, without saying anything at all, "I see you clearly now, and I'm not available for this anymore." They felt that. They felt it when you didn't look back. They felt it when you didn't check for approval. They felt it when their presence stopped registering as important in your internal world. That's when they realized the shift wasn't temporary. This wasn't a phase. This wasn't withdrawal. This wasn't you needing time. This was a line crossed internally. A threshold. You had reorganized yourself around something sturdier than social belonging self. Trust, and once that happens, everything else rearranges. They tried to re-enter casually. A message here, a soft comment there, a neutral question designed to test the door, and the door didn't slam. It just didn't open. No explanation, no confrontation. Just a calm, unmistakable absence of access. That's when the narrative started breaking apart. Because if you weren't angry, they couldn't justify themselves. If you weren't hurt, they couldn't feel powerful. If you weren't seeking repair, they couldn't position themselves as reasonable. Your piece dismantled their story. They began revisiting the past, not out loud but privately, replaying moments, reframing conversations, wondering where exactly they lost their grip. Some of them blamed you. You changed, they said. They weren't wrong, but they misunderstood the direction. You didn't change to oppose them. You changed to protect yourself. And protection doesn't announce itself, it simply exists. Others felt something closer to discomfort they couldn't name. Because deep down, beneath the justifications, beneath the group logic, beneath the shared certainty, a quieter realization started to form. You hadn't been weak. You had been open. And openness, once it's violated enough times, learns how to close with dignity. You didn't become stronger by hardening. You became stronger by integrating, by letting the experience teach you without letting it define you. That's a rare kind of resilience, and it exposes something uncomfortable in people who relied on pressure instead of reflection. They watched how you carried yourself now. The steadiness, the lack of urgency, the way your decisions no longer seemed reactive. You weren't avoiding anything. You were choosing. And choice, when it's rooted, internally can't be negotiated with. They noticed how you didn't flinch when names came up, how you didn't lean in when gossip resurfaced, how you didn't take the bait when someone tried to pull you back into old dynamics. You weren't above it. You were beyond it. That distinction matters. Because being above implies comparison. Being beyond means you've left the framework entirely. You didn't need to win. You didn't need to be right. You needed to be free. And freedom doesn't argue. It walks quietly, firmly, without asking permission. They struggled with that. Because if your freedom didn't require their agreement, then their authority was never real. It was conditional. And conditions only work when everyone believes in them. You stopped believing, not in anger, in clarity. That's why they couldn't reach you anymore. You weren't hiding. You weren't armored. You were simply no longer organized around them. Your center had moved inward. And once the center shifts, the orbit changes. People who once felt close began to feel distant, not because you pushed them away, but because you stopped chasing alignment that cost you yourself. You allowed mismatches to exist without trying to fix them. You let silence do what explanation never could. That silence wasn't empty. It was full of decision, full of discernment, full of a self-respect that didn't need to announce itself. They called it confidence. But it was something deeper. It was integration. You had taken everything they tried to use against you. The judgment, the isolation, the collective pressure, and metabolized it, not into resentment, into wisdom. You learned where you end and others begin. You learned what belongs to you and what never did. You learned that being misunderstood is not a threat when you understand yourself. That lesson doesn't fade, it compounds. And now, as time passes, the separation grows clearer, not dramatic, inevitable. You no longer speak the same emotional language. You no longer respond to the same cues. You no longer operate on borrowed authority, and they feel it every time they're near you, not fear recognition. The uncomfortable kind. The kind that asks questions they don't want to answer. Because if you survived without retaliating, without collapsing, without becoming what they projected, then maybe the system they trusted isn't as solid as they thought. Maybe numbers don't equal truth. Maybe pressure doesn't equal power. Maybe silence, when chosen consciously, is stronger than noise will ever be. You didn't expose them. You didn't punish them. You didn't need to. You outgrew the environment that made them necessary. And outgrowing is irreversible. There's no dramatic ending to this, no final scene, no moment where everyone suddenly understands. There's just distance, clean and emotional, permanent. You move forward with a lighter step now, not because nothing weighs on you, but because you learned how to carry weight without letting it bend you. They remain behind, still negotiating narratives, still counting numbers, still trying to make sense of something that no longer includes them. And you don't look back, not because you're angry, but because you're done. And that, more than anything they tried, is what changed everything.